right, so first and foremost, why soil health? We've got higher yields due to soil health, and I know that's a pretty broad statement to make, but soil health really does lead to more productive plants in your farm or garden. Healthy plants are a big part of why we want soil health. Healthier plants are going to resist pests and disease, and that's going to really make a difference whether we're gardening or farming, and how much time and how much money we have to spend on addressing things like insect pests as well as diseases. So if we've got healthy plants, which comes from healthy soil, we're going to be overall more successful in our production. And related to that, healthy soil supports biodiversity or soil life forms and a diversity of those life forms, right? If we've got a healthy soil food web, that's going to mean that we've got predators and beneficial insects and animals that are going to be helping us solve insect and disease problems in the garden, as well as helping us do things like break down carbon. And if we've got if we're adding organic matter, soil organisms can take it and pull it down into the soil and help us through that cycle. So we want rather than sanitizing our soils, we really want to have a nice diverse food web, and healthy soils lead directly to that. So what exactly is healthy soil? Well, it's got to be fertile, right? Our plants need to eat just like us. They need food, and so they need to have access to nutrients. Now, we've got our macronutrients like nitrogen and phosphorus and potassium. We've also have lots of other things, our minerals that our plants need, and a healthy soil is going to have an abundance of those. Healthy soil is also going to have an abundance of soil life, right? We just talked about how it's important to have lots of different kinds of soil life so that things are balanced, things are kept in check, right? We don't have too much of one thing or another. You see in this picture, we've got the earthworms, and those are really going to help incorporate organic matter. And so healthy soil is going to have that abundant soil life. Good physical properties, right? So I'll just kind of go over a few here. Depth. We've all probably tried to work in shallow, stony clay soils, and it's just not as productive. If we can have nice, deep soil that's well aerated, well drained. We've got the term tilth here, which just means the overall structure and how the soil particles hold together. We don't want something that just turns to dust, and we also don't want something that just clumps up. We want something kind of in between. That also relates to drainage, right? Here in Kentucky, we get an abundance of water throughout the year. And if a soil it isn't well drained, that water just sits on the root systems of the plants, on the stems, and that can cause diseases and all sorts of things, all sorts of problems that we don't want. Blossom end rot. There's a number of water-related damage that can happen to our crops. On the flip side there, we've got water holding capacity, right? Our crops certainly need water. And for the most part here in Kentucky, we get plenty of it. But if we can hold that water close to the where it can access it, that's an important factor in not having to water as much, having to run our irrigation, which saves us time and money. And finally, a healthy soil is going to be high in organic matter. Organic matter is just dead things, leaves, wood, insects, whatever else that has broken down and become stable in the soil, right? Mark's going to talk a lot about organic matter tonight and how to improve it and why it's important, but it's definitely a component of healthy soil. as is a balanced pH, right? Our pH is a measurement of how acidic or alkaline our soil is. A pH of 7 is neutral, and a healthy soil, especially for crops that most of us grow, is going to be around 6.4 to 6.8 in the pH range. We'll talk more about that. So if you don't know exactly what that means, don't worry about it yet. But that does play a big role in healthy soil, especially as it pertains to our crops. Soil testing is the way that we can measure or monitor how healthy our soil is, right? This way we can measure the nutrients that are in our soil, the things our plants need to eat. We can measure the pH, and in a lot of cases, we can even measure organic matter. And I'll talk a little bit about that here in a moment. But it's going to tell us what our soil needs and what it doesn't. Now, we've all gotten, or most of us, we've gotten a soil test back. Sometimes it gets a little overwhelming. These are, scientific documents. These are built in a lab and sent out to us, and so they can be hard to interpret or overwhelming. But there are folks that can help us through that. Our local cooperative extension offices are excellent folks to get in touch with. They do soil testing, so you can submit a soil test through them, or they can come out to your farm and do a soil test. And they can also help you interpret the soil test as well, which is really important. And we here at Grow Appalachia provide the same service to the folks that are in our programs, so you can reach out to us. But I just want to point out a couple of key things here for tonight's conversation. So this is a test from the University of Kentucky's Cooperative Extension Service. And right here, we've got soil pH. Now that's different from the buffer pH. Our actual soil pH in this case is going to be 6.3. And so that's the number that we're looking for to tell us whether our soil is in the healthy zone, where most of our crops get the best nutrients, or if it's more acidic or alkaline than we need it to be. Buffer pH is just a measurement of how much solution it takes to change the pH. So that's for helping the lab calculate how much lime they need to recommend. So that's not as important for us as long as we get lime recommendations, which we'll talk about a little bit later in the workshop. Also down here on the bottom corner of this UK test, in this particular case, we paid a little extra and gotten soil organic matter tested. So here our soil organic matter is about 2%, which is actually pretty standard for a lot of Kentucky soils. But we like to see it higher, right? We talked about how important soil organic matter is for healthy soil. And so the more that we can increase organic matter, really the more productive and the more easily manageable our soils are going to be. And so it really is a good idea to go ahead and pay a few extra dollars. I think it's $5 extra to have that added to the test so that we can measure that throughout the year. And hopefully we're increasing that instead of drawing down on it, right? This is just another example of a soil test. This is from Waters Ag Lab in Owensboro, Kentucky. This is the one that we here at Grow Appalachia use for the moment. It gives us just a nice visual, and it's might be easier for some folks to interpret, but it's got the same information, right? Soil pH and our buffer pH are there at the top. We've got our organic matter here, which this is 3.34, which is really great. That's somebody who's got probably really healthy soil. All right, I'm going to turn it over to Markwalden, who's going to talk to us a little bit about soil organic matter, what it is, and how to improve it in your soil this fall.
All right, thank you, Chris. All right, hello everybody. Let me get my screen shared here with you.
Did we want to do some questions if anybody has questions for Chris.
I haven't seen any in the chat box yet. Kayla, did you catch any?
Nope, I have not seen any yet.
All right, I must have done a good job.
You did.
All right, well, we'll turn it over to Mark for now. And if you all have questions for me, go ahead and put them in the chat box and we'll get to them at the end of the workshop.
All right, good evening, everybody. Again, I'm Markwalden. I know many of you, and I look forward to getting to know the rest of you. Thanks for spending some time with us this evening. So we are going to talk about soil organic matter. So what is soil organic matter? It is the carbon that's in our soil, or the decomposing organic material that's in the soil. Basically, it's the dead stuff. And when it's in the soil, it's in two main forms: active organic matter and stable organic matter. Active organic matter is made up materials like grass clippings, leaves, food scraps, manure, and these all provide nutrients or food for the soil biological community. So all the worms and the other little things that we can't see that Chris was talking about in the soil food web. Stable organic matter, or humus, develops as the active organic matter breaks down and it becomes more stable in the soil structure. So active organic matter has a lifespan of anywhere from a few days to a few months, and stable organic matter has a lifespan of months to years, depending on the conditions in the soil that it exists in.
Mark, it looks like you're in presenter mode.
Okay, is everybody seeing the presenter side? Let me see if I can square that up. How about that?
That looks great.
Okay, thanks. Technical challenges. All right, so we can thank Matt for these slides. So we want to clarify here that we're talking about humus, which benefits the soil and the soil web. And what we are not talking about is hummus, which is a Middle Eastern dish made of chickpeas. You know, I can see if I can talk the crew into doing a little webinar on recipes that we make from stuff out of the garden. So if anybody's growing chickpeas out there, if you could tell us about it in the chat box, we'd love to hear about it. And thanks, Matt, for that slide. So why does organic matter matter? Well, like Chris was talking about, organic matter helps to develop a beneficial soil structure, which allows for good tilth and aeration. It helps to capture and hold on to the nutrients that are passing through our soils. And then it also helps to manage water. And it does this by the design of the structure of the stable and active organic matter. So much like a paper towel will capture and soak up water on a hard surface like a counter, the material in the organic matter can also capture and hold on to some water. Also, in most cases, the organic matter structure has holes and cavities in it that are going to act as little storage areas for water to pool. It feeds the plants and the soil life. So again, going back to that healthy food web. So our little things that we can't see, up to the worms that we see, and then even the animals that are above ground eating those worms. It improves the physical properties of the structure. So it's going to help break up the difference between the sand or the clay in your soil and hopefully help you establish a good loamy soil that's kind of in between those two. It's not too far one way or too far the other. And we'll talk about that with pH. Balance is a critical piece to this discussion. The soil organic matter helps to neutralize pH in the soil. And we'll talk later, Matt will talk about why that's important here soon. Let's see here. So how do we build soil organic matter? We're going to do that through the addition of organic matter. Generally, your soil can't produce organic matter on its own unless it's in a wild environment and is not managed. So the way we do that in a home garden or a larger market scale garden is we're going to look for inputs, basically. So those inputs might be compost, like we're talking about here. Compost is a really great organic product to add to your soils. It's biologically active, so it has that soil community that you're wanting to improve in your own soil. It's got that community readily available in the compost. So by adding that, you're increasing the population of that soil community. It adds nutrients to the soil. Not a lot of nitrogen. Generally, compost is going to have minimal nitrogen in it, somewhere around probably 0.5 pounds per 100 pounds of compost, of nitrogen. So it's not going to be your nitrogen replacement, but it's going to be like a balanced meal that you're feeding to your soil life and your plants. It can be used as a mulch in a no-till system. It'll have to be fairly deep so that you can help suppress the weeds. And again, that active soil life is going to help suppress the disease pressures that are in the either in their soil or coming through the air. Having a diverse population in your soil, that soil community, is going to take up room for the negative entities to not have as much room to spread and damage your plants. As far as scale goes for compost, it's generally not going to be used much larger in a much larger scale than a garden or a market farm. It just doesn't pencil out for a commercial grower, a large scale row crop grower. Ideally, you can buy it in bulk. The larger shipment that you're able to order, the cheaper the compost is going to be. And generally, you're going to be buying it by the cubic yard. If you want to try to keep the cost low on your compost purchase, if you want to go in with a neighbor and split a load so that you can split the cost of that compost, that's a good idea and a good way to increase your or save some money, your return on investment. And compost is a good investment because you're going to have return in healthy plants and healthy produce. The next input we're going to talk about is manure. Manure is used from everything from small raised beds up to commercial row crop growers. It's been the input of choice for probably thousands of years. And it can be fairly available depending on where you're at. So it's generally available in this area if you know anybody that's raising cattle or horses. Even petting zoos have excess manure that they're looking to get rid of. So, you know, be resourceful and look for folks that are willing to share that black gold with you. It adds nutrients, but sometimes it can overload your nutrients. So you can see an increase or a buildup in phosphorus and potassium in your soils if you use too much manure. if the manure hasn't had time to age or compost, those phosphates and sulfates are going to be fairly high in the manure, and you want to give it time to leach some of those out so that you don't end up with an excess amount in your garden or fields. As I mentioned, the phosphates or the salts are going to can be an issue if you use the manure in excess. Weed seeds is probably one of the biggest issues in manure. Horse manure is likely to have quite a bit of what's called pigweed. It's a hated weed in this area, but just keep that in mind. When you do add manure, you're going to be introducing some weed seeds into your system. And then the other concern is foodborne illness. So we want to be careful about how we use manure and make sure we're not transferring an illness to our customers or family. The source of your manure is important. You don't want to use municipal waste, which is used in some sectors of agriculture. And you want to ask the farmer that you're getting it from whether or not they use a broadleaf or other herbicides. Broadleaf herbicides can persist in the manure for up to 3 years or more. And so you just want to be careful about that. All right, and another slide on manure here. We talked about either composting or aging the manure before applying it. You need to till it in or incorporate it into the soil and follow the 90, 120-day rule, which I'll discuss here in a moment. And then the livestock, if you have livestock grazing in the area where you're going to be growing food, the manure they leave is just like the manure that you would add yourself. So you have to follow the same food safety rules and production or best management practices, which we'll talk about now. So if you're applying manure in an area that the crop will have no soil contact, so trellised beans, peppers that are up off the ground, corn, tomatoes that are trellised up off the ground, those crops that the part of the plant that you're going to consume, as long as it's not in contact with the soil, your window for applying the manure is 90 days prior to your harvestable crop. So that means you need to till that manure in 90 days before you're going to harvest a tomato off the plant. So the 120-day rule is for harvestable portion of the crop that may come into contact with the soil. And so that would be greens and, turnips and beets, strawberries, anything, even beans. If you're growing bush beans that are laying on the ground, those would follow under this 120-day rule. And again, what that means is the manure needs to be incorporated into the soil 120 days prior to you harvesting that crop. It doesn't mean you can't start a crop in that 120-day window, but you can't harvest a crop within that 120-day window. So again, this is just reinforcing that it needs to be tilled in and not just sitting on the surface. Manure that sits on the surface of the soil stays manure. It breaks down a lot slower than it would in the soil itself. And again, that 90 and 120-day window is prior to your first harvest. Other practical, affordable ways to increase your soil organic matter is mulching. So you can mulch with compost. It's an expensive mulch, but it works well and will break down over time and enter your soil profile. You can use straw and hay. Again, with this, it's unlikely that they're using any broadleaf herbicides on it, but you'd want to check with the supplier if you can. Leaves, so going out and raking up leaf mold or leaves off your driveway, wherever you can get those are a great amendment to the soil. Cardboard is considered a mulch and is organic matter. You don't want to use cardboard with any glossy images on it. It can be color, but as long as it's not glossy, it's okay to use. So you don't want to use like those advertising slicks in the paper. Wood chips are generally available in most areas as people come through and clear the lines, the electrical lines. So if you can catch those crews out near your place, they probably dump some wood chips there for you. You got to be careful, especially with wood chips, about tilling it in prior to planting a crop. It will steal some nitrogen from your plants. It's fine to have it on the surface of the soil, but if you've got an active crop in the ground, you don't want to, or if you're going to put an active crop in the ground, you don't want to till that wood in until it has time to break down some. Other practical ways, we certainly encourage cover cropping. It can work well at different scales. It's more suited for medium to large scale market gardeners, and then much larger row crop growers, they're going to use cover crops if they're conservation conscious. Again, it has some limitations for small scale. You may need some different equipment to actually apply the cover crop. Some of the equipment we use in the applying lime part of this presentation can also be used for cover crop planting. It can be a challenge to time your crops. So that's part of the experience, the learning experience with cover crops is generally your cover crops are grown in the shoulder seasons, in the fall and the spring, and they can run into the period where you want to plant your main season crops. So you just want to make sure that you have your calendar laid out so you can plan for that cover crop timing and give it time to provide you with the benefits. And we also have some great videos on our YouTube channel. Matt has a series of videos on cover crops. He's our resident star. So if you have some time, if you could jump over there and subscribe, you'll have access to all of our additional videos. And I think I'm going to turn it over to Matt here.
Well, let's, you've got a couple of questions here, Mark, that came in.
Okay.
Kayla, do you want to?
Yeah, a couple of them were actually for Chris, but I will address the one from Mark. Mark, it comes from Debbie Cook asking, what did she do with the bear manure that was left in her gourd patch last weekend?
Hey, Debbie. I guess you could thank the bear for leaving you some nutrients. But if it's in an active cornfield where you're going to try to be harvesting soon, you can either segment that area off if you want to make sure to follow that 90, 120 day rule and not harvest in just a narrow window there around it, or you can actually remove it from the garden if you're concerned. But likely what's going to happen is you'll go in and till that in the next time you prep the soil.
Great, thanks, Mark. Next question was from Shane Fields asking about, he's having issues with weed seeds in his compost pile. And he's wondering what he could do to sterilize and keep those weed seeds out without using chemicals.
All right, thanks, Shane. If it's a compost pile that you're managing, the trick is to get your mixture right to try to increase the temperature of the pile. The pile has to get up to around, I believe it's 160 degrees or so for it to kill off weed seed. That can be a challenge depending on how much manure and other green material you have to put in your pile. So it can be a management issue, but if you're buying in compost, you should definitely let your compost supplier know that so that they can adjust their system to get that temperature up.
Go ahead, Chris.
Add one thing in there real quick. I've had similar issues, and I've used a a black plastic tarp just to completely smother out the weeds. You know, you can give them some space, let them germinate under the tarp. Of course, they'll die if the light's excluded, you know, and then you can kind of turn what's underneath. And if you do that a couple of times, that process should eliminate most of the weed seeds because they'll germinate, right? Because they're nice and happy under the warm, wet tarp, and you know, they've got the compost there, but then they'll die off. So that may not completely solve your problem, but it may really help eliminate a lot of the weeds that are coming up.
And then while we're on compost, is it okay to use pine chips and would covering with mulch raise the temperature?
Yes, it's okay to use the pine chips. Are you asking if the covering the compost with the wood chips would help with the temperature?
Yeah, or with mulch in general, just, you know, a pile there.
The mulch probably won't increase the temperature of the pile all that much. I guess it depends on how much you're applying. But so if you're applying mulch in the garden, it's generally going to actually lower the soil temperature because it creates a little barrier between the sun and the actual soil. But on the compost pile, if you add enough, it's probably the pressure and the weight will help increase the temperature of the pile. And, you know, once you reach your ideal temperature, you'll then want to turn that pile and wait for it to reach that temperature again.
All right. And then a couple questions for Chris from Woody. Should you all be asking, or should we be asking for any other extra things from the soil test besides organic matter?
I think organic matter is probably the most critical. If you're growing something like beets or brassicas, it can also be helpful to figure out where your boron is at. Not all soil tests come with that standard. So boron can be helpful. And if you do suspect that you have any kind of a nutrient deficiency, you know, if you're seeing chlorosis or something like that in the leaves, you can also ask for a more broad spectrum test, which will test for some of the micronutrients that might be lacking there. Things like magnesium, zinc, manganese, things like that. But for the most part, a standard test, I would say 95% of the time will do just fine. Throw that soil organic matter in there, and that should be great.
Great, thanks, Chris. We do have a few other questions, but I think we should probably move on to Matt's section, and we can finish out any remaining questions at the end and or address them after our webinar ends today. Thank you all.
All right. Here we go. Okay. So I'm going to be talking about soil pH, and let me just hide this. So we actually have some videos that we put together that are on YouTube. That's going to be the major part of my presentation here. I really did try to find some good pH jokes. Anyway, I'll leave that there. Okay, so this is our first video on pH. We're going to stop in between and do some slides, but here we go. Please do stop me and let me know if this doesn't work, because I can't see any of you. Never mind.
Hi, I'm Matt with Grow Appalachia. We're a program of Berea College. Today we're going to be talking to you about soil pH and why it's important for your garden or your market farm. So what is pH? Well, it's basically a measure of how acidic or how alkaline your soil is. So we have a range of 0 to 14. 7 is right in the middle. That's considered neutral. Anything lower than 7 is acidic. Anything above 7 is considered alkaline. Why is pH important? Well, your plants are only able to take up nutrients in a certain range effectively. So we're shooting for a pH of about 6.4 to 6.8 for most garden plants. Anything below that, they're going to have trouble having access to the nutrients they need. Anything above that, too alkaline, they have the same problem. Think about it as if you were sitting at a dinner table and you've got a nice long table, and right in the middle is where most of the food is. And as you get to either end of the table, the dishes start to thin out. So if you're sitting in the middle, if your pH is neutral, you've got access to all of the nutrients and food you need, right? Your plants are happy. If you're sitting on either end of the table, you're going to have to really reach to get some of that, some of those goodies, right? So that's kind of a good way to think about it. You don't want to be on one side or the other. You want to be kind of right in the middle there. We've got a graph here that shows, kind of the ideal pH. It's got these nutrients on it, and you can see as you get to one side or the other, those nutrients become limited. So we do have exceptions to the pH rule. One of those is blueberries. Blueberries like acidic soil, right around 4.5. There's a couple of ornamental plants that are that way as well. So, we do have some specifics if you're growing different things, but for the vast majority of garden plants, you're going to want it in that, like we said, the 6.4 to 6.8 range. If you do need to bring your pH down, which occasionally happens, especially out west where there isn't as much rain, we typically do that with sulfur, elemental sulfur. And if you need to do that, like if you're growing blueberries, talk to your extension agent or give us a call at Grow Appalachia. We can help you calculate how much sulfur you need and how to get that applied.
Okay. So I just wanted to bring this graph up again because it's just pretty neat to see, and it was kind of hard on that video. So here's our pH range at the bottom. Again, here's kind of our ideal range. So you can see that's why it's so important. And applying lime is a pretty simple thing to do to make sure that your plants have all of the nutrients accessible. We have another video here that's going to talk about different types of lime. Here we go.
Hi, I'm Chris McKenzie. I'm with Grow Appalachia of Berea College, and I'm here to talk to you today about lime. What is it, and what type to use, and where to get it? So lime is going to be a soil amendment that we can use to bring our pH up. So if we need to adjust our pH towards the more neutral or alkaline part of the pH scale, we can use lime to do that. And if our soil test comes back and it shows that we've got soil that's more acidic than we need it, lime is the way to go. So there are some different types of lime, and I'm going to talk a little bit about those. Here we've got a couple of bags just to show you and demonstrate. Both of these you can use on your garden or farm. This is labeled as garden lime. This is labeled as lawn lime. They're both considered ag limes or agricultural limes. And so you can, if you're going to a hardware or farm store, you can ask for it under any of these labels: lawn lime, garden lime, or agricultural lime. These are two different products because here we've got a pulverized lime. So it's a fine powder that comes out of the bag. This has also been pulverized, but then it's been pelletized. So we've got small little pellets that make it easier to spread. So in terms of logistics, oftentimes this one's going to be healthier and safer and just overall easier to spread. So this is the one that we typically recommend. Now there are some different types of lime that you're going to want to avoid. One being slaked lime, another being hydrated lime. Those limes have more construction type applications. this is what you want on your soil. One other difference that you may need to know about is the difference between calcitic and dolomitic lime. So both of these are actually dolomitic, which means they contain a little bit more magnesium than a calcitic lime. A calcitic lime is pretty much all calcium based, whereas these, again, the dolomitic is going to have a little bit more magnesium. Now, pretty much anybody can use dolomitic lime in their soil. There's not a concern about magnesium in terms of putting too much on. And if you need magnesium, the dolomitic is definitely the type to go with. If you don't need magnesium and what you can find is the calcitic lime, that's just fine. That's going to raise your calcium and also raise your pH, which is what you're looking for. All right, so we just wanted you to be able to see the difference between pelletized and pulverized lime here. This is the pelleted lime. See, we've got these nice little pellets. Now this is just as finely ground as this pulverized lime, but it's been pelleted together. So it's a lot easier to spread, a lot easier to handle. It's not going to create a dust cloud. Whereas this pulverized lime, see how fine it is, and it can really get up in the air, and it causes some people, some lung problems if they're spreading it that way. Now, if you're not going to get lime in a bag, you can also get it in bulk form. So straight from the quarry, it's going to come powdered like this, pulverized. And, typically a quarry is going to have a truck that's able to spread it. So if you are on a larger scale farm where you need to do a couple of acres, if you're doing a pasture or something like that, then it may be a good thing to look up your local quarries and see if you've got a bulk source, just because it's going to be cheaper that way. So if you're buying 50-pound bags of lime to spread on, several acres of pasture or paddock, that may be too expensive. So if you are going to go the bulk lime route, there's a couple of extra considerations to make. The limestone that comes from your local quarry may not be as effective as the bag lime that we've got here. So we have a factor called the relative neutralizing value, and that can be a lot lower in local limestone depending on what the source is. And so you're going to need to know that value for whatever your source is and use that to calculate your lime application. Now, what we recommend is that you contact your extension agent, or you can also contact us here at Grow Appalachia, and we can figure out what that value is and help you recalculate your lime to account for that if you're going to go the bulk route. Another factor to consider if you're going to do the bulk lime is that a lot of times they're hauling that lime in a 15 to 20 ton truck. And a lot of times they're going to want to, make that full load. So if you can split it with a neighboring farm, that can be a good idea if you don't need that full truckload.
All right, looks like we got one question here from Heather to Chris. Chris, I'm sorry. What were the types to avoid hydrated and?
Yeah, so the other one I mentioned there was slaked. I think the bottom line is, there's some limes out there that are meant for construction or industrial use. Hydrated lime can also be used to clean out a barn if you have some bad microorganisms that might be there from manure. It can be used to sanitize, but what we want is agricultural lime, which can be found as garden lime, it can be lawn lime, or it can just be labeled as ag or agricultural. So that's what we're looking for. And luckily it's it's the most easy to find. So.
And I apologize for the cricket. That was my kid's bedtime alarm, and I clearly did not mute my phone. So that was my bad. We do have actually one more section here on pH. And so let me get back into that unless there, unless there are any other questions about lime here. I don't see any more. Let's see here. All right. So we do have some worksheets that can help you figure out what would make the most sense on your farm, whether the bagged lime or the bulk lime, you know, that accounts for some of the stuff that Chris was talking about in the video, that relative neutralizing value, and then penciling out the cost. So we will probably send that out as a follow-up email, a link to this, or you can email us and ask for it, and we'll get that to you. We've got one more video here, Mark talking about how to do some calculations and then how to apply lime, and then we'll have just a general question and answer at the end.
Hi, I'm Mark with Grow Appalachia. Grow Appalachia is a program of Berea College, and today we're going to talk about lime. So how much lime do you put on, and then how do you apply it? So how much lime do you need? Well, the best way to be able to tell how much lime is a soil test. You want to make sure to get a soil test either early in the spring or late in the fall. Ideally, you can put lime on in the fall so that it has time to activate in the soil. On your soil test, if you don't specify that you would like your calculations in 1,000 square foot increments, generally it's going to return to you in a tons per acre calculation, as you can see here. In this example, they're recommending 2.1 tons of lime per acre. The way you work through that calculation is first you have to turn your tons per acre into pounds. And so we do that by multiplying the tons figure that's given to you on your soil test. You multiply that by 2,000, which is the number of pounds in a ton. So once you have your pounds number from your previous calculation, you want to divide that by 43.5, which there are 43.5 thousand square foot increments in an acre. Okay, so let's work through this calculation. So it was recommended that we use 2.1 tons of lime per acre. So multiply 2.1 times 2,000. That'll give us 4,200 pounds. So that means we need 4,200 pounds of lime per acre. So we'll take that pounds calculation, 4,200, we'll divide that by 43.5, and that'll give us 96.8 pounds of lime per 1,000 square foot. So what we have here is called a drop spreader. There's a lot of different brands. The reason it's called a drop spreader is because as you roll along, the material drops out of the bottom straight down. Unlike a broadcast spreader that's going to spin and sling the material out to the side, this is going to apply the material directly where you want it. So the way the drop spreader works to help keep material from either caking up on the discharge area and also applying it consistently, has an agitator in the bottom of the spreader. So this will spin and help keep the lime material loose and broken up, allows it to drop out of the bottom more evenly. So different spreaders have different ways to calibrate how much material comes out of the spreader. In this example, you turn this knob, and that either allows more material to go through or less material to go through. The spreader can also be used for seed, fertilizer, and other amendments, so it can be a multi-use tool. When you're adjusting how much material is going to come out the base or calibrating, what it's doing is it's moving this bar down to open the holes up wider and wider to allow more material to come through. Other tools you might use to apply lime to your garden would include this broadcast seeder. This one is also known as a belly grinder because you're going to wear it over your shoulder and you're going to crank the handle to sling the material off of your rotary blade. It also has a metering area to adjust how much material comes out of the seeder at the base, and that's going to help manage the application rate of the lime that you're applying. So another thing to consider when you're using your broadcast applicator is generally you only want to use a pelletized lime material in the spreader. If you use the pulverized lime, it's going to create quite a dust cloud that can affect your eyes and your respiratory system. If you only have an option of using pulverized lime, you're going to want to wear at least a basic respirator to keep that material out of your lungs. So this piece of equipment here is a drop seeder, but it can also be used to apply the pelletized lime material. This larger hopper is for larger seeded cover crops, but in this example, the pelletized lime would go in the large seed hopper. So anytime you're working with lime, you want to make sure that you have gloves on and some basic eye protection. The lime material can cause irritation of your skin and of course also your eyes. So when you're pouring your lime material into your drop spreader for the first time, you'll want to just put in maybe a quarter basin of lime to make sure that the amount of lime doesn't bind your agitator that's in the base of the spreader.
Thanks for joining Grow Appalachia for this video. If you like the content and you'd like to see more, be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel.
We tend to shoot for a
Oh, we had a few bloopers there. I don't know what's going on here, y'all. Well, that wraps up the videos. I don't see any questions coming in on that last piece of the video. Matt, are we good here?
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Great. Kayla muted me, so I didn't critic you guys again, which was very good. Yeah, sorry, I cut off your blooper reel there. We can maybe watch it at the end here and you can see all the funny stuff that we goofed up. I just have a couple extra slides to add some clarity and then we're done and y'all can ask questions. So again, this is just where you're gonna find that pH number on your soil test. This is the one you'll get from the University of Kentucky. What I wanted to show was they will have your lime recommendation down here. And then usually the county office will put down here in the bottom, if you need lime, they'll put the local quarries and what the, you know, we talked about this relative neutralizing value, and they'll automatically adjust your rate based on the quarry. So that's a really nice thing that the University of Kentucky folks will do if you get their lime or their soil tests. Just a couple quick things to keep in mind. You do want to till in the lime after you spread it if you can. You know, obviously on a pasture or an orchard or something, you can't do that, but it will help it break down much more quickly than it just having to seep through. So applying it in the fall, like Mark mentioned, is going to be great. It'll give that time to neutralize before you plant in the spring. And, you know, depending on your source of lime, if it is coarser, you're going to want to put it on ahead of time so it has more time. You can find the information about the quarries online. The University of Kentucky's got this, their ag lime reports. So we'll have this link at the end as well, but you can find that so you can figure out what your closest quarry is. And they also have some calculators online. You don't have to download anything. It's right there on the browser that you can kind of put in, you know, your soil test, and it'll spit out kind of what you need. So there are resources available, and then yeah, we've got some sources of compost and things here. I'm going to go ahead and stop here and open it up and see what we've got in the way of questions.
All right, so looks like we've got a question that Mark just answered on the chat box about using different spreaders for lime versus cover crop. Looks like there's no reason to buy two, so you could use the same one. And then Richard Olson asked a question about the best time to apply ag sulfur to lower pH.
Yeah, so sulfur is going to be different than lime. Richard, that's a great question. Sulfur is broken down in the soil by microbes. So lime is a chemical reaction that happens in the presence of water. Sulfur is actually broken down by microbes, and they're only active when it's warm. So if you put sulfur on now, you're going to lose a lot of it because it's going to get washed away as elemental sulfur before the critters can turn it into sulfuric acid, which is actually the process that takes place, and bring your pH down. So you're going to want to wait until spring to put that sulfur on. Good question.
Awesome, thanks. And we've got another one from Shane here asking about if you are applying roughly 12 inches of compost to your garden, how do you figure out how much lime to add and when is best to apply it since he's not tilling?
Was that 12 inches?
That's what I'm reading here.
That's a heck of a lot of compost. And what compost is going to do is bring that, it's going to bring your pH up if it's low, and it'll actually bring your pH down if it's too high. So
I'm sorry,
compost,
Pardon me,
mulch. 12 inches of mulch is also a lot of mulch. Yeah, that's going to depend. Shane, mulch is also going to likely bring your pH up as it starts to break down. And this is where we get into the art of soil science, right? If you take a soil test and then you go put on a bunch of compost or mulch, it is going to affect your pH a little bit. So I would say go ahead and you know, get your test, put on the recommended amount of lime, maybe go towards the lower end, and then adjust, and then, you know, add your compost or your mulch. And you know, most of our soils in Kentucky, unless you're in a bottomland, in general, are low pH. And so you're going to continue to have to put lime on every, you know, 2 or 3 years. You should still get a test to know. What you don't want to do is put it on every year. But it will start to creep back down eventually on most of our soils.
Thanks, Matt.
Kayla, I've got some questions a little bit further back here. This is from Larissa, and she asked, would a manure tea be something that could be used in the garden closer to harvest time, or would you still need to be 120 days out? So Mark, I guess that question's for you. Would a manure tea be something that could be used in the garden closer to the harvest time, or would you still need to wait that time?
You would still need to wait. Manure tea is going to have the same food safety issues as manure itself, because the manure is in the tea. There's no process to break the manure down into a safe form by putting it in the tea. So yeah, it would be treated as fresh manure.
Great.
So you'd have this, follow that same rule.
Thank you, Mark. I got another one. This one seems like it could be for Chris or Mark. Regarding improving soil in containers, this is from Ashley, without replacing the soil every year. So I'm assuming she's container gardening. I don't know if it's raised beds or non-permeable containers?
It depends on the size of the container. If you're talking about growing in like a 5-gallon bucket, likely you're gonna at least mix that soil with some improvements, especially if you're growing vegetables, because that amount of soil is not capable of sustaining multiple crops. The nutrients are going to get used up. It's going to be spent. If it's in a raised bed container, again, it depends on the scale. You can add mulch over time and kind of incorporate that mulch each year to try to improve your organic matter. But it's going to be a question of scale, how exactly you manage that.
Awesome. Thanks, Mark. We've got one way back here from Shane talking about growing bananas and adding Epsom salt to add potassium and magnesium, and isn't sure of the ratio.
I'll tackle that one. Yeah, so magnesium is hardly ever a limiting factor in growing here in Kentucky. We typically have pretty good magnesium in our soils, and from what I understand from the University of Kentucky agronomists, they haven't shown that adding additional magnesium is something that most folks have to do on most soils. So, you know, which is Epsom salts have magnesium in them. That's a magnesium sulfate. And so what we typically recommend is, you know, go ahead and get your soil test. If you do have a documented magnesium deficiency, Epsom salts can work for that. If you don't, I know it's, you know, it's in a lot of old wisdom, you know, when you're planting tomatoes, throw some Epsom salts in there. It can actually build up in the soil and cause some problems because it's a salt. And yeah, so I would say get tested, and if you have a deficiency, go ahead and use it. Yeah.
Awesome, thank you. Another one from Craig asking about growing in urban environments, and how do you all feel about testing for heavy metals when you're building compost, using compost in urban settings?
Yeah, I definitely recommend getting a test. If you don't know the use of the site prior to your use, I think it's always the best bet to go ahead and get tested for heavy metal content.
Okay, we got one from Kenny asking, what would be the best organic matter to add to your soil for best results? I would say the black gold, as Matt claimed earlier. Which isn't easy to come by.
Yeah, compost, I think, is always going to be your best bet. You know, again, with a qualification that a lot of folks, it just doesn't make economic sense to spread that over a couple of acres, right? If you can't concentrate that compost enough and you're just kind of dusting the soil with it, it's not really making a big difference. But if you can put it on, you know, a couple of inches thick, that can really make a big difference in terms of a lot of different things, right? Compost contains nutrients, including our macronutrients, nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. It contains a lot of micronutrients as well, and it's going to increase your soil organic matter. And it's broken down enough to where the plants can already start using those things. But it's also like, you know, we have some medicines that have slow release capsules on them. It's the same kind of concept, you know. Some fertilizers you have to worry about, you know, burning and things like that from the high content of salts and things like that. But compost is just going to slowly release the nutrients over time, and is just an all-around good amendment to use. You can add it to like the containers. There was a question earlier about, you know, how to improve your container garden. Adding compost is great for that. It's great for raised beds, and even if you you know, do have a larger area and you want to make that investment, a lot of times it's going to pay off.
Great, thanks. I think we got maybe one more question here, and it's from Woody asking about adding worm compost teas, and if the 120, 90-day rule also applies for adding vermiculture tea. I don't know the answer out or I would answer it, sorry.
I'll tackle that. And I don't know for sure, but I am fairly certain that it depends on what you're feeding the worms, right? So if it's manure that the worms are eating, you're going to have to go through whatever the standard is for composting. And I believe there are specific organic standards for composting if you're in a certified organic system for vermicompost, specifically worm castings. But if you're composting manure, it's going to have to go through the same, I would say, safe bet would be the same 90-120 rule. If it's just vegetables, that's not actually considered manure, and so it can be applied without those restrictions. But Chris and Mark might have a better take on that.
I think you're spot on, Matt. Yeah.
Yeah, you know, to some degree, you're going to have worms eating things and pooping in your garden anyway. But you know, if you're intentionally adding what I would consider a soil amendment, right? This is still qualified as a soil amendment. I think, you know, I always err on the side of caution in terms of food safety.
Yeah, so as we were talking, I was just looking up the organic standards, which is where we get these guidelines as a recommendation. Even if you're not organic, that manure rule is a good idea. And it's likely going to be coming down for everybody on the Food Safety Modernization Act. But here's what they say: vermicompost must cure 6 to 12 months for outdoor windrows, 2 to 4 months for indoor container systems, 2 to 4 months for angled wedge systems, and 30 to 60 days for continuous flow reactors. So that's coming out. That's for vermicompost and USDA organic guidance.
Awesome. Thank you, Matt. Still touching on manure here. Bruce and Karen asked if we know of a good source of manure in the area. I don't. I wish I did.
So probably the best source is going to be one that's local, because manure is heavy and wet, and to ship it is expensive. And so shipping is probably going to be actually more than the material itself if you end up having to have a truck come from some facility. So trying to find a local, probably cattle farmer. You know, horses tend to have more weed seeds and higher potential for you know, broadleaf herbicides and things like that. So we usually recommend cattle manure if you can get it. And you know, if somebody's especially if somebody's got a barn or something like that where the manure is more concentrated and they're scooping it out, that's going to be a good source. But you know, manure is not something that you'll necessarily find at a landscaping store. You're more likely to find compost there, and it's also not something that they'll generally sell at a southern states or anything that's like that. So a lot of times it's just coming from a local farm.
Yeah, and Bruce and Karen are in Northeast Georgia. I saw. We're not down there regular enough to know a good supplier, but if you got a local farm store or something, just go in there and ask whoever is working behind the counter, or if there happens to be a group of people sitting around a wood stove, might inquire with them.
Oh, makes me think of Montgomery's here in Berea. All right, you all. Well, I believe that's the last of the questions here. If any of you all have any last things to add, please do. But if not, that is.
They're in Central Kentucky. Sorry, Bruce. I thought I read earlier that you were in Georgia. I will add real quick. We were talking about soil tests earlier and things you can add additionally to your soil test. If you have a high tunnel, it's good to get a soluble salts test. That way you know if your salts are increasing over time. So that first one just gives you a baseline of where your high tunnel is currently, and then you can monitor that salt buildup over time, which can happen from you using municipal water or fertilizers or any number of ways. So that would be the only addition to the soil test.
All right, folks, as I mentioned before, this content will be sent out to you so that you can use it at will. We'll have those videos there. We'll have the resources that we talked about throughout the session. And we'll have, you know, the entire presentation on YouTube as well. So please feel free to use that and share that. And I'll go ahead and include our contact information on there as well. And so that if you have any follow-up questions, you all can reach out to us individually. That's what we're here for. So we love to talk farming and gardening, and so we'd be happy to correspond with you. Thanks again for coming. You all have a great night, and get a soil test, get some put down if you need it. And you know, manure is a good fall amendment as well. So thanks, folks.